one of the people we invited to the launch of the Heart of Arabia expedition, which was held at the Royal Geographical Society in London, with Princess Anne as our patron, was a guy called Joe Owen. And I find Joe Owen an absolute inspiration. He writes very, very well-written books about the fundamentals of leadership, but he comes at it from a very different angle, and I like his writing style of short sound bites. The book that guides much of my thinking on leadership is Joe's book on tribal leadership. Joe spent time living with traditional society, living with the Maasai, living with people in Papua New Guinea, spent time with the Bedouin, and just asked the question that a lot of people don't ask, which is why when modern businesses struggle to survive more than 20, 30 years, sometimes some of the biggest organisations in the world don't exist 30 years later. How can it be that people survive in some of the toughest environments on the planet for thousands of years? So Joe asked the question, what can modern business learn from traditional society? Which I find absolutely fascinating, the value of apprenticeship and slow learning as opposed to fast-track PowerPoint, for example. But at our launch, we didn't ask Joe to talk about that. We took him into a side room at the Society and asked him his opinion on resilience, because one of his latest books is entitled just that. And with mental well-being and all of the issues brought about by COVID, resilience has become a buzzword once again. And in my naive little world, I always think back to people like Philby and Scott, that era. They were around at the same time, and just don't forget that Shackleton and his men returned from Antarctica just months before Philby arrived in Saudi Arabia. So it was an incredible era full of amazing people, and my thinking superficially is that, well, people were much more resilient in those days. They were much tougher, and today we're kind of a snowflake generation. But actually, Joe's take was very different to that. And his argument was that people then were much more, life was a bit more stable, and you tended to have a job for life. The church was there, your family were there. You didn't have to worry about mortgages quite so much. But young people today have to deal with a much more dynamic world. So, we still have the elite performers who push the boundaries, the ultramarathon runners, the people who sail single-handed around the world. They're still there. Those outliers, they still exist. But in between them, you have the rest of us who don't perform at the extremes, but have to manage a much more uncertain future. Young people today have to juggle so much more than perhaps young people did in 1917. So Joe's argument is that young people are really just as resilient as they were many years ago, but actually life is very different. How human beings perform in extreme and remote locations and situations is one of the three science projects that we're doing on this journey. The other two being looking at lithic artifacts for evidence of people having occupied what is the biggest desert on Earth. Thousands of years ago, it was very different. It was green, and people lived here in much larger numbers. And the evidence for that lies under our feet in terms of Stone Age artifacts, like arrowheads and scrapers that would have been used for hunting. The second project we're doing is for a team at Coast. We have a camera trap that we put out every night with a tin of tuna to see what mammals might come and eat in front of the trap, and the trap will take a picture of the mammal. But we also have a bat recorder that we try and use to capture any calls of bats. But how human beings perform in extreme locations is of real interest to me, and I'm going to shift from a desert of sand briefly to a desert of ice, because a definition of a desert, of course, is a place that has less than 250 millimetres of rainfall a year, and the high Arctic therefore falls very much into that category. And again, on the theme of following old explorers, back in the 90s, I led an expedition to an uninhabited island off the north coast of Canada called Melville Island. It was named after the Lord of the Admiralty, Viscount Melville. And it was named that by a young man called William Edward Parry, who was born in Bath in England. And Parry, at the age of 20, in his 20s, was given command of 2 ships, the Heckler and the Griper. And they set sail with 3 years' worth of coal and food, because they were so uncertain as to whether they would come back, how long the journey would take. Many of the signing on forms that I found in the library in Bath were signed with a simple cross, because many of the sailors were illiterate at the time. But what I've got Parry's journal of that diary of 1820 on my bookshelf in Muscat, Oman. It cost me about £400 about 30 years ago. And it's a beautifully written chronicle of their journey to try and become the first people to find a way through the Northwest Passage. And many people laughed at Parry, because when he set sail from London, one of the last things that he loaded onto his boat was a barrel organ and a printing press. And people thought, well, what on earth are you loading a barrel organ and a printing press on a boat setting sail to the Arctic for? But Parry was given command for a reason. He was a smart man. He knew that if they got into difficulty, success or failure would be lost in the minds of his men, not in the muscle of his men. And he knew that routine would be absolutely essential, and that idle minds were a recipe for disaster. Sure enough, Parry's worst fears came true. They nearly sailed through the Northwest Passage. They nearly became the first people to do so, but they were running out of time and the sea was starting to freeze around them. So they backtracked to a little inlet that they named Winter Harbour, because the boats were frozen in there for the 4 months of total darkness. And that was the period that worried Parry the most. But then that's where the routine came in, and that's where his leadership and his forward thinking really shone. Because routine being important, the men were woken up at 6 a.m. every morning. Didn't matter whether it was dark or light. Over the side of the boat onto the sea ice, physical activity to warm up and get the blood pumping. Lining up on the deck, the ship's surgeon would go along the mouths and inspect your gums for scurvy. Then you go down below before things warmed up. You'd shake the ice off your hammock and brush it over the side so you never had any water freezing on the boat. But they produced every month a theatrical production on the boat. Everyone had a part. Everyone had to learn their lines. Everyone was involved, and everyone was focused. It occupied minds. They also produced, via the printing press, the most northerly newspaper in the world, the North Georgia Gazette. 2 or 3 sheets of paper that now you can pay several £1,000s for if you go onto a second-hand bookshop on Google. So there's much to be learned, I think, about leadership by looking back, whether it's Philby, whether it's Shackleton, or whether it's Parry.